Today we're going to be working on mitered corner dovetails. These dovetails are going to have a mitered corner at both the front and back of the dovetails. You'll see I've laid out the case so that it's made of one continuous board. I have continuous grain running from front to back. I'd like to continue this aesthetic by mitering the front edge and take advantage of the mitered corners with the back edge so I can then hide the rabbet, which will hold the case back inside that back corner. I've begun the layout starting by marking my center lines, marking the back of the case. I leave the case material a little bit long so that I can trim it to size, but I don't want it to affect my dovetail layout. So I've set the pins at 1.5 inches from each other, and I've set aside the tools required for this particular layout. Now we'll begin the layout by marking the approximate center. In this case, my case is just shy of 18 inches, so we will mark the center just shy of 9 inches. I'm going to start my first dovetail. In this case, it'll be the tails, by splitting this tail right on that mark. They're going to have 3/4 inch on either side. Now, my plan is to have a very small pin, so I'll then mark 1/8 inch on either side of this line to set the basic layout for the pins. Next, I'll mark the baseline. In this case, I'm using a marking gauge. This particular marking gauge is already set to the thickness of this panel. Now I can immediately transfer the thickness of this panel onto the side panel with the marking gauge. Now if you keep a medium, not so heavy line, you can plane this off for the most part once everything is set. I'm also going to mark my ends, mark the inside. I like to strike a heavy line on the inside because it prevents, or I should say minimizes, tear out the outside edge. Now I like 14-degree dovetails, and I don't have a dovetail saddle for this particular size. So what I've done instead is set my sliding bevel to 14 degrees, and I can use that to lay out my dovetails. Now that I've laid out the first one, I'm going to continue this along, marking out 1.5 inches and 1/8 at each tail. I've got about 1 3/4 at the end there. I'm going to leave that. That will be later turned into the tail and pin that are going to be a combination of 45 degrees. Next, I make sure to mark which parts are going to be cut out. I don't want to make any goofy errors and have two tail boards or two pin boards. Next thing I'll do is transfer over my marks. A couple of things that I've done in preparation for this project, or this part of the project, is to prep the stock. Now when I prep stock for dovetails this particular width, or anything in the case range, you want to make sure that you're working with flat stock, otherwise you're going to be causing yourself aggravation. What I do to begin this is to joint my stock and make sure that I have an accurate thickness. Remove any wind. And doing so, doing those three things allows me to minimize the amount of errors that I have to account for in the dovetail work. It also makes for more accurate dovetails. You'll notice that I use my marking gauge that works off of this particular face. Now, in order to prepare for that, I have to joint this face perfectly flush, or perfectly perpendicular. See that I've done that right here. And it's also flat. Now the reason being, if there's a dip in this, when I use my marking gauge, the dip is going to represent on the bottom of this as well. So if we follow that along, I'll have a dip in the case, which I then can't plane out without making the one end or the other end very small. Now, if these are standard dovetails, you can hide some of those things, but in this case, since they're miter edge dovetails, they're not so easy to hide your mistakes because they show up at the miter. Try and lay this out in a way that you can see it. Corners here, I just put a mark. There we go. Making sure that I can remind myself exactly which parts are being removed on the miter. It can get pretty confusing once you get a little ways into it. Now that we've finished laying out the tailboard, I've chalked it up in the vise, and we can begin sawing. Now, to begin sawing, what I've done is put aside the saws that will be required. First one is a Dozuki saw. This is about 14 teeth per inch, and it's a nice rip cut for this size of material. If you're working in very thin material, then you'll want to stick with a finer saw. For heavier work, obviously, a heavier saw. I've also put aside my coping saw. Once I rip cut these, I'll then go in with the coping saw, cope out the waste, minimizing how much I have to chop out. Also makes work a lot easier on my chisels. Last, I've laid down a square. The purpose of the square is for a visual reference. I put it up against the back of the board. I have a nice, perfect 90-degree visual reference. Now, before I begin sawing, I will line up my saw with my wrist and elbow. In this case, with also the square that's laid on the bench. Now when I'm sawing dovetails, I like to do all of the same angle and then go back and do the opposing angle. Now, I don't want to overcut my lines on the inside because I'm going to see that on the inside of the finished case. If I do, it's not something I really find appealing, and it doesn't look like professional work. If you intend to finish off the saw, it's important that the saw cuts are actually straight. If they're not straight, you're going to have to pare, because the transferred mark and then saw cut in the opposing in the pin board are likely going to be straight. The joint won't come together properly. So if you begin to stray off of your mark, it doesn't really matter. Just continue. You're way off. Okay, all the rip cuts have been made. Next we can cope out the waste. Now, those of you saw like this particular one has a very thin blade, thinner than the blade of the coping saw. So what I do, instead of follow down the saw line, or the kerf, would be to simply split the waste in half. And turn the saw towards the bottom. Take out the waste. And install my baseline. Next step in the process of building these is to rough out the miters. Now if you can't cut straight, it's important you don't get too close. And if you can cut straight, it's important that you actually do so. I gave myself a little bit of room on this one just in case, because there's no second chances.